There we are. So whenever you're ready, Sandra, to share the screen, I think.
Can you see it?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So wonderful to see you all, and I would like to know more about your background, which is to me is more interesting than my own, but I will love to give a little bit of an introduction to how we got to this, because I've known Hannah for a long time, but I haven't said that I actually almost forced her to in this project on a very short time basis. No, but okay, just to say that this is part, how do I do the, here, sorry. I'm not used to Zoom anymore. To say that this part of a much longer running interest and project of mine on postcolonial intellectuals. So it's been going on for several years, funded by the Dutch Research Council and realized in collaboration with many partners across Europe. This idea, what is an intellectual, has been very inquisitive for me in order to understand what is the role of intellectual in bringing to the fore issues of postcoloniality within and across and beyond Europe. Or is that the accident of birth? Is the topic they deal with in the strategic form that they choose? So we had a series of conferences, as you can see here. The first one was more theoretical. The second one was more going away from this notion of the intellectual as the ivory tower magna figure and thinking more about mobilizing the notion of the intellectual, not as a normative, as someone doing something in the public sphere that can expand to writers, artists, activists, and archivists. So intellectuals, in a way, it can be any of us, as Gramsci would say, but also with a qualification of making an impact and changing the status quo. This was 4 conferences, the last one we had in Venice during the Biennale, and that is also when we launched this visual project, visual data visualization project, which is a way to see how postcolonial intellectual operated within and across Europe, trying to figure out where the nodes would be for their encounters in terms of life, in terms of work, but also in terms of legacies. It's always a bit tricky to have like a digital humanities project, but it was kind of interesting to see what kind of figure we would prioritize, what kind of narrative we would create around them, and also the way in which they relate from the past to the present and also geographically. And while we were doing this, I really got intrigued by this idea. So many postcolonial intellectuals have been working within the field of cinema, either featuring as testimonial or just inspiring the way in which new way of doing cinema is conveyed. And in that way, I was very much trying to bring together the passion of mine, which is to combine postcolonial studies and cinema studies, as already done in Postcolonial Cinema Studies, the volume I co-edited 10 years ago with Margaret Waller. So that's why I know that Cristina Mendes is also very much interested in cinema, and we had this kind of idea of figuring out, specifically with the postcolonial intellectual, which one are the interfaces that we could think of in relation to the intellectual and the way it is actually impacting on cinematic production. So before I go into that, I don't know how many of you have been thinking about what is an intellectual and what is the genesis of it. It's a long debate, and I'll try to keep it very brief here because we want to know into the heart of the matter, which is also in the special issues. So Gramsci is one of the first who wrote about it, but Said also dedicated his brief lectures on this, trying to say that the intellectual is actually someone who has to represent the disadvantaged group, someone who is out of place, unsettled and unsettling, and somehow speaks truth to power. So we see very much the intellectual as a towering figure who has the responsibility to speak for the oppressed and for the people. In that way, he has a little bit of a sensualistic idea, but also romantic idea of what the intellectual is and needs to do as an actor of change. So for Said, the intellectual, is a kind of representative figure. For other post-structuralist thinkers, Foucault and Said or Spivak, the issue change. But for Said, very much embedded with this task of being a spokesperson, a voices for those who are marginalized, and very much in the post-colonial spirit. When we did this book on post-colonial intellectuals in Europe with my colleague Adriano Habet, we asked Engin Aysin to reflect a little bit on the notion of the post-colonial intellectual, and he came with this beautiful quote of saying the post-colonial intellectual are not identity that can be located specifically, but that are actually actors who know how much they are at the interface between the local and the global, the specific and the universal, and somehow operate in a kind of transnational, transversal way. So they are very much aware of the legacies of colonial and post-colonial regime, and as much they're trying to make this kind of mediation between the past and the present, but also between different interests and different political arenas. So very much beautiful, the idea of being a transversal figure. I think I'm going back. And this is what we try to think, who are this kind of intellectual who actually started to think about the role of representation. Representation has been always key in post-colonial studies, but the field of cinema and the field of post-colonial studies never really engaged with each other in a structured way. They were also disciplinarily separated. And here you have the very famous quote from Frantz Fanon about watching a film of Tarzan and the question of being Black and how it changes your participation and identification if you are in the audience, either in the Caribbean and you're Black, or in Europe. So in the Caribbean, you would identify with Tarzan, that's a famous quote, with the action figure. And in Europe, Fanon would be interpolated, identified as the savage in the film and not with Tarzan, because he will be alienated from himself. I think what came first to mind was the beautiful film made on Stuart Hall, the Stuart Hall Project, and the way in which this collaboration between John Ackroft and this mega intellectual figure, Stuart Hall, actually happened, which brought us to reflect the many cases and instances in which this dialogue and dynamic between cinema and the intellectual took place. So we started brainstorming and a little bit digging, trying to think of the figure that actually were predominant or more obviously, not because they made films themselves or because they were object of filmmaking, but because they really helped or challenged the way in which visual production or visual register were made, and somehow offered a little bit more space to those who wanted to work beyond the mainstream culture or the context in which they were being represented, Blackness had been represented so far. So this is a famous interviews of Stuart Hall in which he actually say that he is an intellectual. He's been, and he's very much doing intellectual work, and therefore he stand by this definition, not something which is elitist, but something that actually allows him to be in connection with the work and the world that he does. So have you all seen this film? Is there any need to show the trailer? No, okay. We'll leave the space to Anna, who has also some clips for something more relevant that you might not know about. So this is the, let me know if I go over time because I have so many screens here. So in this documentary is the way in which Ackroft challenges this representation in Blackness in British culture. So even though Stuart Hall was not a filmmaker himself, he dealt a lot with photography and with media culture. So it was very much prominent in the way of rethinking the way this history of people who have a long story to tell were being framed and broadcasted. And the original thing of Alcofra is really to try to create different registers, which are very much based on archival material, but also very sonic intervention. And of course, the role of Miles Davis has been here central to create a sense of immersive experience beyond the visual.
Can I just say something, Sandra?
Of course. I
About
see very little with this full screen image, so just interrupt me.
You see, about the Stuart Hall project. Of course, this is a fantastic documentary for those of you who haven't seen it. I use it a lot in class because it's brilliant in terms of also introducing cultural studies and the figure of Stuart Hall. And also John Akenfra's filmmaking, because in fact what we have here is what is interesting, and Sandra was mentioning about Stuart Hall's interest in media culture and photography, but in fact, but also Stuart Hall wrote about Akenfra's filmmaking. So this is this conversation unfinished, unfortunately, right? Unfinished conversation, and in fact, this is the outcome of other a bigger project between of John Akenfra. This, in fact, speaks to the work of two intellectuals, because not only is, and this is also what we wanted to when Sandra in particular asked James Harvey to write on the Stuart Hall project, was also to spotlight John Akenfra as a public intellectual in itself. And I think I'm not overstepping here, because this is a conversation between two intellectuals. Because one of the points that Sandra also made with the project, with the network, is that the public intellectual is not just the one who writes the theory, right? It's also the artist who, through his art or her art, builds concepts and acts theoretically on the world, aesthetically and theoretically. And I think, in fact, we started with with the Stuart Hall project because precisely of its richness, and because it brings two public intellectuals together. Sorry, Sandra.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, we should keep it as a dialogue, because otherwise it becomes boring. But also because, yeah, I was thinking of Isaac Julian when he did the film on Fanon. Of course, you always have the beautiful intervention by Stuart Hall. So it's been a bigger featuring in the visual culture as an icon himself, and also trying to redress the way in which Frantz Fanon saw representation, but also Isaac Julian transposed Frantz Fanon into the screen. And then we started. Yeah.
And interesting that you have this now this image of Trinity Minha, because I must say that Sandra's original intention, I think, or the way I perceived it, was to have was to do a special issue on women intellectuals and filmmaking. But I don't know, the examples we got were not enough, or we really tried to come up with sufficient number of intellectual or cinematic engagements and female intellectuals or women intellectuals, but I believe at some point we just were reminded of Toni Morrison, Trinity Minha, and not much beyond that. So in fact, the examples of male public intellectuals became much more prominent, and we abandoned the idea of making this exclusively on women intellectuals.
Well, I don't think we want to do only women intellectual. In the post-colonial intellectual, always been struggling in finding the female figure, though at the end we
Yeah.
managed, you can also see in the digital atlas, but only you have to think a little bit further from the obvious. You really need to be trained and also in looking. So in order to avoid like this recolonization of the issues of intellectuals in cinema, most of the images were, again, the big ones, you know, Frantz Fanon, Stuart Hall, Steve McQueen. And we had Asia Jabbar, of course, is a cineast, and we really wanted to include her, but one of the author actually drew out, how do you say, at the last minute, which was a shame. And of course, we can have many other filmmakers who are intellectual, Tracy Muffa, many other, but we were trying to think more in the spectrum of intellectual figures and their engagement with cinema directly. So you can have also a lot of female filmmakers who have not been thinking of writing or reflecting too much on the role of as intellectuals. So that was a little bit the cruise. And Trimina is the exponential figure, of course. Oli's been in this, and she's been kind enough to engage in a beautiful dialogue with Domitilla Olivieri, who is my colleague, who has been working on her work for a very long time. So you can see in the dialogue, there is also a lot of depth and nuance about the articulation, how Trimina is actually refusing to be seen as an intellectual, she doesn't want to have this role as it becomes like speaking for, and she's very much about the speaking nearby. So interesting in the way she wants to deconstruct it. So this is the people we came, because the special issues is also limited, and we will be very happy to do like a version 2. So a next step. Yeah, I think I would love that actually. Maybe with you we can brainstorm what would be possible, what we've been not seeing, we've been blind about. It was a wonderful collaboration, and Anna will tell you more about the unique scoop that she had by being able to interview Ai Weiwei, who's actually now living in Portugal. But we managed, so Toni Morrison, because not everybody knows, but she's made in this film in the Louvre, and this Lyrica Plata has been able to do a wonderful article on that. So this is some of the people that we managed to focus on, Raoul Peck, Ai Weiwei, Steve McQueen, but of course many more would be possible. And the idea was to focus on this dialogue between intellectual as filmmaker, but also intellectual as object of filmmaking, and the way in which they have, in the post-colonial sense and the post-colonial cinema studies sense, expanded this way of using the lens for expressing post-colonial realities which are submerged or erased. And of course, was always one of the first to say that representation is key. So cinema is actually the important thing of framing reality, and is not in place of reality. Is already said. And also try to understand this figure of the post-colonial intellectual at the crossroad between theory and praxis, both as a source of influence on critical question of representation, otherness, and minoritization, and the larger-than-life character's presence on screen during the lifetime or through cinematic testimonial, managed to change both the language of cinema and the interpretation of the figure of the intellectual. So all these kind of things we've been already discussing, and James Harvey has already been mentioned by Anna in this beautiful dialogue between two intellectual titans, and each one of them having their own style and also impact on the way in which this filmmaking came into being. So maybe instead of talking more, I will give the floor to Anna, because she has a lot of things to say and I don't want to take too much time from her. Are you okay with taking over from here?
Yeah, for sure. Of course, people would love to continue to listen to Professor Ponzanesi,
You know.
and I'm very fortunate to be able to have worked with you. First, we began with sort of a backstory of our relation. We started with a bit before, but with your book on intellectuals in Europe, where I wrote on Salman Rushdie, because I did my PhD on that, on him, and then I'm very fortunate to be able to have been able to learn from you, and in fact, I would like to publicly thank you for including me in these very interesting activities. Though I must say that transnational cinemas, band screens, was my idea, so I take credit for that because of the previous work I have done with
I also worked
Deborah.
with them before.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I also have a special issue when it was called Transnational Cinema.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, I missed
Yes.
that because you have so many. It's easy to miss. There are so many. Sorry. So cannot take complete credit. So of course, this was done in record time, I must say. And Sandra was mentioning that this is the first time I'm hearing it of that she would like to do a second installment, and Deborah said something positive wrote on the chat, and in fact it was there's so much scope to explore on this, because in fact this was done in record time. It was everything was very fast, in the sense that people were very excited. Once we got the contributors on board, everyone was very excited, in fact, to be writing about some works that had already been released a few years back, but they were very excited also about writing about very recent work. Like, for example, in this case, I was very excited to write about Exterminate All the Brutes, which had been released on HBO the year before. And also Florian Statler was very excited to write about Small Axe, which had been very recently released. So there was a lot of momentum and excitement around this idea, and there's a lot of scope and much more that can be explored on this. Of course, many of us are interested in cinema and TV and transnational screens, of course, now expanding into streaming, and all screens gives us this possibility of addressing all these different platforms. So I have, in fact, I don't know if you were able to see the table of contents. In fact, I have 2 contributions in this special issue. Sorry. And at some point, I told Sandra that it was too much, and I wanted to not do Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, because I already had committed to doing the interview with Ai Weiwei. So it seemed a bit like too much, like being the guest editor that suddenly also is doing another article, taking space, and doing another interview. But Sandra insisted.
It will
yes.
be the tutorial. Here we missed the editorial again, so it has been like a
Oh,
lapse
yes,
from the very
again.
beginning. Yes.
Yes, that was a lapse. I don't know why, but yeah, the introduction, the editorial is not here again. Yeah, because we've been working always on the same basis, on the same document, which does not have the editorial, and then it's copy paste, and then we end up with without the editorial. Yeah, so that it's the editorial the Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes and the interview. And of course, because Sandra was focusing on these intellectual figures, I initially mentioned Raoul Peck, but then I also mentioned that Ai Weiwei was living very near where I live here in the south of the country. In fact, half an hour from here, in a very sort of secluded area, a rural area. And she, of course, said, why don't you ask him for an interview? And I said, oh, probably that will not work because it's Ai Weiwei, right? But it did, and you have it there, the world as a ready-made, and I will explain it a little bit in more detail if I have time. And I was checking today, and if I got it correctly, and apologies for it's not boasting because it's of course all the credit goes to Ai Weiwei. It's the most read or visited article of the special issue, of course, because of his
Fame.
you know, fame, of course.
Thank you.
And it's open access, I think. So please fact checked, but it seemed that like it was one of the most read articles of the special issue. So now going to Raoul Peck. And I know at least Deborah is a big fan of Raoul Peck. We are all, I must say.
You want this image or not? Back.
Maybe go back to the abstract. So what I did, because there's so much in thank you. There's so much in Exterminate All the Brutes, because as he explained in his statement of intent, he wanted to compress in 4 episodes in this essay film 6 centuries of history of white supremacy. I focused on reenactments, and I used a particular concept, that you will know, those of you who work on photography in particular, Ariela Azulei's idea of potential history. And with that concept, I worked on 2 reenactments, as you can see there, pictures of Henry Morton Stanley and Kalulu or Ndugu Mahali, and also the dramatization of Frederick Farrar's lecture on the aptitude of races that was delivered at the Ethnological Society of London in 1866. So these are all 2 factual events. So these are real pictures, the real photographs that were taken to celebrate this Victorian explorers' exploration of Africa and finding David Livingstone. And also this lecture was really happened, and it was published, and it really presented this hierarchy of races. So it's very interesting what he does in this. Maybe you can move to the next slide, Sandra, please. So of course, this is the image from HBO. Next slide, please. I'm not going, we don't have time, but if you're able, just check his statement of intent, where Raoul Peck mentions that with this film essay, he wanted to break the boundaries of documentary filmmaking. I don't know if we have time. Do you think we have time to listen? Because it would be very nice for all of us who are interested in documentary filmmaking.
Yeah, I think so. But
can you go back? Yeah.
Can I do something with
yes,
it?
Yes, with the hand. Does it work? No, it does not.
Yes.
With the hand.
Yeah, this is what you want me to show?
No, because it should go to YouTube.
Yes, we are in YouTube.
The Holocaust.
You are?
Yes, can you see it?
Only you probably, I think. I'm not seeing it.
Okay, so it means I have to stop the PowerPoint, right? No.
Sorry, Sandra.
Yeah, it might be, Sandra. So then if you've got the YouTube on your screen and you can share that other screen with us, potentially.
How do I stop the PowerPoint and change the screen?
If you go to the list, yeah, that's it. If you even just minimize it
I
rather
think
than
you'll have
stop
to
it.
stop sharing and then reshare.
Okay, yeah.
Is this
Sorry.
okay? You have it? You can see it now?
No, what
try-
we're seeing is we're still seeing the presentation. So
So I share and then,
Stop sharing
okay.
and share again.
And then I share what? The PowerPoint?
PowerPoint,
it's
yeah.
Yeah?
yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Can you-
Thank you.
Can you start?
Yes.
Where it all started.
Sorry, can you go? Can
But
you
to talk
begin?
about
Begin. Can you go to the beginning? And
Yep.
this will be the only video I'll show.
Is this okay?
after my film, I Am Not Your Negro, finding a project that would make as much sense to me was challenging. James Baldwin's words had basically firebombed every known field of bigotry I knew and had annihilated any attempt at deniability of the racist monster that lurks in corners of our societies. But despite the film's success, I found out that there were still vast territories of resistance, innocent stubbornness, and sheer ignorance laying around. And I felt that I had to tackle this. I had to address the even bigger picture. I had to find the foundation of it all and deconstruct it from the ground up. When I first read Exterminate All the Brutes, written by Sven Lindqvist, the ideas and connections I had begun to thread were suddenly laid bare in front of me. The entire story I was looking for was on display. From Africa to America, from slavery to Europe, from Germany to the Holocaust, all the way to where it all started. But to talk about America, I had to address the origin story, the story of the Native American genocide. That's when I found Roxanne Dunbar Artist's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, an important part of the puzzle. Then I found the third book, Michel Rolfe Trouillot's Silencing the Past, which would bring me back to my own story with Haiti, a country forcefully overlooked in its role in changing Western world history. So then I was now ready to deploy the story from its beginning. 600 years of history in one single film. But because this film also is about cinema, I wanted to push the boundaries of conventional documentary filmmaking and find the freedom to tell this story by any means necessary. Exterminate All the Brutes weaves together archival footage, documentary footage, dynamic animation, voiceover, and scripted fictional scenes. It creates a new narrative that can carry the nuanced and emotional levels of the subject matter and crack the core story from the inside out. As writers, creators, filmmakers, we have no choice than to reflect our societies and provide knowledge and challenges in addition to mere entertainment. And as artists, we need to break the limits of our art. This is what this film specifically and concurrently set out to achieve. Exterminate all the brutes.
Thank you, Sandra. So In fact, it was what got me interested in or the angle I pursued was precisely this interest in telling the story by any means necessary and breaking the limits of documentary filmmaking. And for that, I focused on scripted scenes and also his reenactment of photographic settings. Sandra, can you share the PowerPoint again? And I'll try to be very
I'm not
fast
sure
now.
because now I cannot find it anymore.
But in fact, we have already run out of time. So
I don't know how to go back because now I get the screen and not the PowerPoint again. I don't know where it went.
Sandra, I suppose if you close the YouTube, you'll be able to go back to it.
Okay, thank you for the technical advice.
My limited technical.
Oh, sorry. What did I do?
nothing yet.
Oh, you're still there. Sorry.
Yeah. You haven't left us yet.
No, it's still the same. I don't know.
Shall I try and do it myself?
Yes, please. Please
Or
try.
Anna, if you want to talk through it, perhaps, so that we can have. Oh, there we go. There's some
No, that's
screen.
only the screen, not the. I cannot find the
I
PowerPoint.
see.
Do you
Do you
have it,
wanna-
Anna?
You happy
Yeah,
to
let me-
talk through it a bit, Anna, and then so we can have some time for
just-
discussion?
Just wanted to show you the pictures actually.
Okay.
Sorry. Let me see if I can.
Have you got it? Have you got it, Anna? Because you
I've
can
got,
try
yeah.
and share as well.
Yeah, for sure. And we are here for the discussion. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Bit of Portuguese. You have so
Bit of
many beautiful
Portuguese.
images, so I think you should show them at least.
Yeah, so because it illustrates what I was saying very quickly. For example, you have here an example of how Raoul Peck images of himself, he puts himself inside the story with images of himself, and you have this brilliant still here from Exterminate All the Brutes, where you have him in front of Harry Morton Stanley in Leopoldville. So this is the kind of intermixing that he does. And also one of the reenactments was precisely with Morton Stanley and Kalulu renamed, and he does this reenactment with actors where you see the scene being the mise en scène being set as if we were behind the camera. And we hear the photographer say, "Oh, act like you are watching the Nile," or something like that. So it's very, very, very interesting. And here is an image, a production image of Peck directing this British act in this reenactment of this lecture. And it's interesting because you have the lecture being reenacted, and where in fact Frederick Farrar, who was a linguist, divided the races, human races, into three groups: the savage, the semi-civilized, and the civilized. No point telling which races correspond to which. And very interestingly, this is a very Victorian kind of reenactment, but there's a contemporary audience. And the audience rebel against the lecture. So it's fantastic. And they start calling him names, telling him to F off, even, and it's fantastic. It's great. So here now we move on to the interviews, and this is Sandra has already mentioned that we had this privilege of having two interviews Domitille Oliveri with Trinity Minha. Fantastic interview. And these interviews were, and in particular this one, very much participated by the interviewees. So this was done very much with Trinity Minha. So it's a great piece. And my interview with Ai Weiwei focused on an exhibit he was having here in Portugal, on whose centerpiece was a tree. And this exhibit includes a 32-meter iron sculpture, Peki tree, which he and his big crew created out of the original Peki tree that was already dead, standing but dead in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. And he did a copy of this tree and had it exhibited in the north of the country. And there is a companion documentary that documents precisely all this painstaking, very meticulous process of creating this tree. And it was originally 5 hours, a 5-hour documentary. It was reduced to 4.5, if I'm not mistaken. And our interview focused on that. So here are some of the key words that we covered in this interview. And of course, we started with the idea of his art being mainly a conceptual art. His influences, Warhol, Duchamp. We covered all these films because, of course, he has a very extensive filmography, and here are the films that we covered. Just to give you an idea, from his Chinese films to his more transnational films, because of course, before he moved to Europe, or was exiled, or is exiled in Europe, he made several documentaries for a more domestic audience, aimed precisely at documenting Chinese authoritarianism, police violence, corruption, etc. And these are some stills from some of his films, Fairy Tale in particular. I'll go over very, very quickly. His interest in always representing reality. So because of the context where he comes from, where reality has many shades and is presented as the reality, but in fact, for him is not the reality. With his documentaries, he wanted to show reality. And here you have, for example, the police saying that's the reality. Is this reality? Or also another still here from another film, Ai Weiwei's Appeal, and the importance of documenting what was going on. And in this particular case, it was a lawsuit that was being brought on Ai Weiwei, supposedly for tax evasion, but of course it had to do with political reasons. And he wanted to show the world what was going on. And it's important that the entire world is watching. So he did these very raw, aesthetically raw documentaries, whose main intent was to put online as soon as possible, so that the entire world could see what was going on there. And this is from
I'm really sorry to interrupt again. I'm just I'm a bit conscious of the time, just in the sense that we will
I'll
have a
stop
little
here.
bit some time to. So if you want to just wrap it up, and maybe we can pick it up so that people have an opportunity
For
as
sure,
well
for
to
sure.
have some discussion, because we will have to finish at 5:30.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to show
No,
the
I'm
pictures.
really sorry to interrupt that, but yeah.
No,
So if
no.
you just wrap it up,
It's
it'd
this
be great.
always this focus on reality. This is the cover of Coronation, and this was about his influences, Duchamp and Warhol. This particular film, his latest Tree, about the making of the tree. And here are some images, and you can see here Ai Weiwei also being cast as the tree is being cast also. So it's sort of like a parallel between him being cast into this. Then you have this sculpture, the two figures. That is the result of what you saw before. So he wanted to feel what the tree was feeling. And here is the exhibit of the film here in the north, in the exhibit. Here are just some stills from the film. So this is the actual tree, and this is what the scaffolds around the tree to cast the tree. Here is the molding, or the team, a big team involved of Chinese and Brazilian artisans. And here is the sculpture in the European exhibition venue. Here, the tree was cast in such detail that he even cast the inside of the tree and had to buy a very, very specific silicone that was used to reproduce jewelry, because he really wanted to capture all the details. And that's it. Sorry, I'm sorry for this. for all this detail, but it's fascinating stuff for me. Thank you. Sorry, Yael.
Thank you very much. No, not at all. It is fascinating, and it's fantastic to see. I was just conscious of people's time, and I wanted to give them opportunity to pick up some of what the wealth of what we've seen. So I won't hold my position as I'll open it up for anybody who wants to say something, ask something. Okay.
Sorry, I just turned on that. Yeah, no, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And I've this always happens when you ask the first question. It's not fully formed, but hopefully it's generative. I was curious about how a lot of these seem to be very biographical. And, you know, obviously with people like Asya Shabar, this is the sort of crux of her work anyway, is to work from that position. But I'm just wondering if any of these examples you looked at played with that or complicated that idea of a biographical narrative. And in another way, I'm kind of asking that question because I'm interested in what the actual intellectual process is and whether there's a sort of way of conveying that isn't a life story, but it's a process, it's a mode of labor. So yeah, no, I'd love some insights into that and what you noticed with some, you know, a lot of time with these examples. Thank you.
Can I start, Sandra, with just something about Ai Weiwei? In fact, thank you, Kay, for this question. And in fact, I don't know how this complexifies. I think it's a bit up to. I think both, for example, the examples I studied. Sorry for focusing on the examples I studied. Both of them were attempts to process a lot of their personal story. And in fact, he brings, for example, Raoul Peck brings himself to his story because he realizes here's the product, here's the result of that story. So there's no way of escaping that story. And and putting himself and his family and his home films and his photographs into that story of white supremacy. In the case of Ai Weiwei, he explicitly says that all the films he does is just for him. It's for his political curiosity. He actually says, I'm very selfish. And he restated that I'm very selfish. I'm a very selfish person. I don't care if I'm being ridiculous or not. I don't care what people think. I do this just because I want to know more about this topic. So I want to know more about the Rohingya, for example. I want to know more what's going on in Lesbos. So I go there. It's just for my personal curiosity. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Actually, it's trying to avoid this autobiographical overlap between being an intellectual and having this task of speaking for the group you're supposed to identify with. I'm actually now working with a colleague from Columbia University, Francis Negron Montaner, who is an intellectual but also a filmmaker, and she's producing a chapter on cinema as a form of inquiry. So in that, the idea of the intellectual is not the figure in itself, but it's the idea of producing cinema or cinematic form that actually open up different form of knowledge. And how would that happen? So it's not the autobiographical element, but producing kind of aesthetic, political engagement with forms that will open up silence, history, occluded past, marginalized group. So she uses a lot of reference from art, from what Basquiat did, for example, the idea of glissance, the relationality, and her own work, but also thinking the medium in itself as a way of producing an alternative knowledge that open up new way of seeing and understanding relationship in society, which are not just visual and aesthetic, but also political. So through that means of cinema giving a voice to something else. So it's not autobiographical, but it's really in the modality of the cinema in itself, which of course you can have also in literature, you can have another genre, but cinema has a very complicated apparatus. So how that comes into place, you know, as an industry as well is much more nuanced and complicated than individual novel, let's say, even though they are part of a cultural industry as well. I don't know whether it answered your question. I think it was very pertinent and quite crucial.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, both of you.
Will?
Thank you. I'd like to sort of follow up on that question. Most of these articles focus on figures of intellectuals and their work. I never met John Akomfra, but when I was in Ghana in the 90s, I had a chance to meet his family and people he grew up with. And I was, in fact, they had a little party for me where they invited Efwa Sutherland, the dramatist, Abena Busia, the poet, other filmmakers, people who influenced him at a very early stage and with whom he probably still is in touch. And what impressed me was how there was this whole synergetic community. And I thought, this is the embryo, you know, of intellectuals. This is they form and support. We may read books on a shelf by Fanon and so forth, but I wonder if you encountered any of this in your interviews and in your research, the importance of a circle of influencers, because we, I think, have probably had that experience, those of us who consider ourselves intellectual, ourselves. And so where do we see it in these other figures?
You want to go, Anna?
Yeah. I don't know if this goes to into what you were saying, but I was thinking about the importance of family, of being surrounded by a nurturing group and a community that nurtures the intellectual. Because when I went to interview Ai Weiwei, I really realized the dimension of his entourage, because in fact he lives in this. That's what immediately reminded when you were talking about meeting his John Akenfro's family. So he bought this huge mansion here in the country. Mansion, it's not the term here, we call it mont, and it's sort of like a villa, and he's surrounded by dozens of people. He's surrounded by people who support him, you know, on a emotional level, technical level. They were preparing to have lunch, and there was a huge table set for lots of people. He was there with his son. He wanted me to meet his animals, his chickens, his you know, all this is nurturing. You know, it's in a way. You were talking about the books, and of course he showed me the books. He was actually at that point working on his memoirs. He published them recently. The books are important, but he wanted me also to get to know all this, you know, the cats and yeah, it's and it also in Raoul Peck, of course, meet Raoul Peck, but from the 4 episodes, you get to see the importance of course, of his family, the fact that he included home movies, and also I'm reminded of the Stuart Hall project, of how he talks about the importance of expectations that his mother had relating to the color of his skin, for example, that Stuart Hall was the darkest of the family, and also the fact that his sister was not able to marry whom she wanted because he was darker than the mother expect. I don't know. Now, I'm sorry, but it's there are various dimensions to the intellectuals that I don't know if this speaks to what you were saying.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Things that we might have pulled out ourselves. Thank you.
But they are formative. They are completely formative of the intellectual, at least in this, for sure, these 2 cases.
Can I add something before Deborah? Because that was the idea of rethinking the figure of the intellectual, not in traditional sense, but the intellectual as actually a figure being fed by the community, not being the representative of, but actually being the synergy of a lot of collaborative forces. And the idea was, we didn't manage in this issue, but in the book we do more, to move away from the individual figure to the collectivities, to the social movement, to the more horizontal way of making space. So yes, this idea of the individual figure, even Said, you know, the kind of, I always try to study in relationship to all the social movement that gave him the political action that he had, but also in relation to his daughter, to his wife, all keeping his archive, you know, and trying to show him in a much more humble, maybe mundane way, showing different facets. Probably also Akenfro, as you mentioned, had a collective, you know, for his way of film. So he was never an individual figure, and there was a lot of resonances with a lot of people trying to work on collectively on political action as well. So it's always, the individual is, I have fights with my students because they really resist the word. They say, I don't want, the intellectual is not useful, you know, it's really, highlighted this kind of individual figure and then say, no, we're trying now to open it up. We try to make it productive and see in what way actually you need to have that visibility in order to make a change in certain areas. So it's a little bit the idea of strategic essentialism in a way. You need the figure in order to make certain conjuncture visible.
Yeah.
That's actually
But
really
before you say, can I just jump in and say, because I'm burning to say that about this sort of film collective, you know, it's the Film Audiovisual Collective, a conference that it was formed in Portsmouth when I was students in Portsmouth Polytechnic at the time, and you know, when I at some point studied some of it and read some of the early sort of it is so it's not even collective, it's almost, it's a friendship, it's a network of that feeding each other. They really did write about it in those very interchangeable ways. It wasn't a pamphlet, it was a, so it's I think it was a huge dimension which he in his work that he talks about years after as well. Yeah, Debs, gone.
Yeah, no, I just it's fascinating. I'm really enjoying thinking. You're making me think. And if you don't mind me being a little bit indulgent, we did a piece of work recently about the performance group Las Tesis, which is a feminist group in Argentina who produced, you're probably familiar with it, who produced a kind of performance called A Rapist in Your Path. If you look it up, it's really interesting. So they did this performance, and part of their aim was to take intellectual ideas outside of the classroom, and it was part of the Chilean protests, and it went completely viral. And there were international performances of A Rapist in Your Path. It was all about kind of attacking rape culture, basically. And this they took the ideas of a post-colonial or decolonial feminist called Rita Segato, and they wanted to translate the ideas and take the ideas out of the classroom through street performances. And of course, these ideas all spread through the screen because people were watching YouTube videos all over the world. So we have performances in India, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in Mexico, and it became this kind of feminist rallying cry. And I think, you know, your idea of taking it from individual intellectuals and making it a kind of collective movement outside of the classroom, it was a very interesting example. And then I was thinking, you know, I was in Spain at one point listening to a podcast by Laverne Cox, who was sharing the ideas of bell hooks to her audience. So, you know, you've got certain influential screen figures who I think were in a moment of kind of democratizing, where people are taking intellectual ideas beyond the classroom through the means of social media, through the means of screen cultures. And I just think that that's very, very interesting. And as you say, there are these key thinkers, but we're moving away from that intellectual superior voice of God to sort of how can we use their ideas for practical mobilizing in terms of protest cultures, for example. Anyway.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's
the
fantastic.
second issue should be about collectives, actually.
Yeah.
That could be quite interesting.
Yeah, because
So take it as collective.
Yeah, there are some basic feature of the intellectual, which is like this idea of needing an audience and having a charisma, being able to convey certain message in a much more conducive way than others. But there's also this, what kind of medium are they using? And in the past, of course, it was the old press or speeching in a Hyde Park corner, and now it's with the social media. So you don't have the authority anymore of needing to be well connected, having the access to the broadcasting or whatever. And anyone can be on social media, but it creates also this kind of democratization, but also fragmentation and also different way of checking the authority of the veracity of information. So I think one of the inquiry that I have in what way have social media or digital media changed this perception of doing intellectual labor. The influencer, we have also one in the previous issue, no, Anna, on intellectual, which was on Beyonce and the Carters and the role as, of course, a cultural influencer who changed the art world and trying to reintroduce whatever's been excluded into the image. But to what extent are influencer then also intellectual? When do we draw the boundary between being, celebrities, and when is that contribution changing societal structure? Of course, for Beyonce, Bell Hooks already had her own riots about, so it's very, but I think it's a very productive discussion as long as, and also this idea that the intellectual are already dead in the West, you know, we are done with them, we're done with Chomsky, we're done with these ivory figures. But in the rest of the world, it's like very much upcoming with all the social movements and protests and hashtags. So as long as there is injustice, the role of the intellectual is far from being exhausted. Intellectual intended as in very kind of open, collective ways and creative ways as well, not only just speaking, but producing images, art, whatever makes an impact.
I was thinking about your reference to strategic essentialism, and I think and thinking about also what you mentioned about cinema and screen industries and the parts of the industry and the making of or the financial part of it. So I think at this point, maybe the collectives are not as interesting for the industry to focus on in terms of doing films or TV series. I don't know, because thinking about, we came to these examples and we have these we study these screen texts because the culture at some point gave them this authority and visibility. And I think we are not there in terms of the collective yet. I don't know, because, for example, you talked about the Black Audio Collective, but you think then you mentioned is actually or John Akomfra, but they were not the only ones, right? You have, it seems that there's always this tendency to isolate, to make it more the individual. I don't know. Now I remember about the Gorilla Girls, but something that would be, I don't know, is the collective not interesting enough for the film industry or the TV industry to make, I don't know,
But
screen text?
What Deborah's pointing to fascinates me, which I think is a difference in generations.
Okay.
There's a reason why she changed the name from transnational cinema to transnational screens. There are all these little screens. And what I'm hearing in this project that this performance group in Argentina is part of this movement to bring it to crowdsourcing. Is, you know, everybody's walking around with a camera, sharing this in a way that wasn't possible before. And I wonder then if we need to reimagine terms like industry and reception theory and so forth, in terms of what's really happening with younger people with their phones, considering they are connected through social media in a way that intellectuals in my generation could have never been.
I mean, when we lecture on this, Yael and I, we try and make the students make connections between young people with their phones at protest movements and third cinema, you know, things that are outside of a kind of commercial industrial context, for the purpose of raising awareness and fomenting revolution or protest or whatever. Because I don't think I think there is a kind of connection between some of this. And of course, that's not auteurist, it's not industrial, it's not commercial, but it is about using the camera for a kind of political reaction and response. I know we're slightly veering away from the intellectual, but that part of that is taking the subjectivity of the creator out of the
but it also, those movements, I mean, I'm thinking about, in different parts of the world, in some, and I'm thinking about the Palestinian case, for example, that the need to work collectively is still there, and it still happened, and they sort of, so there are these sort of very famous Palestinian filmmakers, figures that are being elevated as celebrities, perhaps by the I don't know if that's the industry as much as the sort of circuit of film festivals and those kind of where there's still the fairly traditional gatekeepers. And there's a need sometimes to work beyond that through the new means, still collectively. And they do spring out in other parts of the world, I think, today as well.
It also allows everyone to become witnesses, you have different level, you're witnessing or you are producing material because you are part of it and then you have this artistic circle that of course have different requirements and might need the gatekeepers, as you mentioned, and also, but it is also what quality do we give to this footage? Sometimes it's because it becomes viral and it has an audience reception of its own, that it acquires a value and an impact. It is behind its point of origin, of course, and it's all extremely volatile as well, thinking of this social media platform and how free they are and by who they are managed, with all the last thing we have on Twitter. But also it's extremely creative and mobilizing for resistance, I think, which was not as easy before with third cinema, but even their medium means were necessary, even for the basics structure. So I see this all in empowering this idea of from below, very much enabled by new technology. At the same time, there are a lot of restrictions still in place, because when everything circulates, what allows something to emerge and not other things, there is always something going on, either it is language or this the way it is clicked or free clicked or shared, that there are some mechanism behind it still. It need to be analyzed.
How important do you think it is to sit with a book for hours and think through the detours of another person's thought, which can only be done individually, and then this other sphere of activity, collective thinking, let's call it, what is lost and what is gained?
There are different modes of engagement. Go with a literary person.
But I was thinking also in terms of, like you mentioned, about focusing on, not that I do that so often, sitting with the book now, but it's more screen, I must say. But I'm sitting with the book in PDF, probably, right? But I'm also, I don't know if we are glamorizing also a bit social media now. Here, I'm thinking of Byung-Chul Han's idea of digital swarm. Not that, of course, he has this very pessimistic view that it's impossible to form collectives, because in fact what you have online are just, not quite a collective, but lots of people just clicking and putting likes, but actually there's no collective force being formed. This is just an illusion. I don't know. And I think there's still, I don't know, sometimes I'm always a bit about social media, a bit not sure how emancipatory. It depends. For example, in the case of Ai Weiwei, for him the internet was completely essential in terms of putting his message out there. but in other cases, I don't know. Sometimes, and you were talking about the gatekeepers. Sorry if I'm probably taking this into another. I was reminded of this idea of now that you have a quiet quitting, and how it began on TikTok. But it began on TikTok, but then it was taken up by The Atlantic and all these gatekeepers that gave it visibility, and academia gave it also visibility. I don't know, sorry if I'm introducing this or thinking that it's sometimes more of a digital swarm than rather a collective being formed through social media. Oh, I don't know. But Sandra, you're
the Sherry Tarko being alone online, you know, in the end.
Sorry.
The Sherry Tarko negative thing, being alone online, that you think you're in a community, but you're actually very much individual. There are, of course, optimists and pessimists, but I think what you were mentioning, sitting with a book, is a question of immersion and the different way that you engage with the medium that you are with. Reading a book is not only a question of time, but also having this
thought, right?
experience that you can have with cinema, you can have probably with VR, but you don't have with the fragmentation of social media, even though within social media, you also have these pockets in which you can have a book available, you can have a film available, you can have, so it's remediation and different things. You have context collapse, as we could say, but it's also a generational thing. Young people wouldn't be able to sit with a book. You really have to force them. It's a different way of perceiving reality and engaging with the fastness of things, but also being stimulating by different timing.
But look at this. This is amazing. You know, we've all read quietly, and now we're all sitting together transnationally through the screen, chatting. So this is kind of extraordinary. Sometimes I feel I'm in this sci-fi world that, you know. Anyway.
It looks
That's
as
what I like about the discussion part of these. It gives us a chance to encounter thoughts we haven't had a chance to immerse ourselves with yet. But we'll probably go home with, you know, these flies buzzing in our ears.
We won't go home, we are home.
We are.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I would like to ask you maybe before you go, whether you had ideas on how to do this, like volume 2, what we coming from your different, because we see many things.
Focus on the collective, I think.
What about the idea?
I think it would be really interesting.
Intellectuals in the world, you know, the intellectuals that, you know, online transnational spaces, intellectuals that have kind of permeated into these online transnational spaces, make it really about screens. Because we did rename the journal, but actually most people are writing about film and television. And actually we would love people to be engaging more in this kind of screen culture and digital media. So that, I think that could be something that could almost be the next, as Jan said.
How intellectual can you be with a tweet? Sorry.
It's more, I mean,
I have a thing with
people that are taking ideas that have belonged in the academy, using transnational screen cultures to take intellectuals outside of the academy, through performance, through film, through you know.
There are all debate being carried out online, you know, and engaged.
But I suppose it's not exactly. It's not about the online. I suppose it's the particular platforms, isn't it? That or the particular frameworks that are consistent online. You know, Twitter is, you know, X amount of characters. There's no way around it, and it sort of by nature always creates that very polarized debate. It's not really a debate. We can't have a discussion on Twitter. We can have a yes or no. We can have, we support it or we don't support it. And that forces, especially when, as you say, Deborah, quite complex intellectual ideas sometimes or figures are being then reduced to, okay, we support this or we don't support it. And, you know, I think that would be a very interesting thing to sort of think about how.
But some figures have an amazing amount of followers and others don't. So whatever they say have a huge impact and circulation, and others remain more isolated. So it depends on the language they use and depends on But also you have this Twitter things that now, because you have only 40 characters, whatever it is, that you have in series, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, you have to read the whole thread before you end. You can get to the end of the meaning. So it's a whole different way of writing and thinking.
I think it's in your research. You know, Anna was just pulling things from the corner of her interviews and highlighting them in a way that she hadn't before. The influence of family, for example, the pets. Speaking of pets, Deborah. But I guess I would like to know is, what is it like to become an intellectual, to be an intellectual in today's world, where there are multiple screens instead of one in front of a multiple audience, where people are sharing little bits of their experience, their glimpsed experiences, as opposed to the immersive experience of engaging in depth with an idea, with a work of writing. But that would be really interesting to me, and I think important.
Yeah, I think the intellectual we started with did both, you know, from Say to Stuart Hall. They sat long and hard with concept and ideas and writing, but they had also this public dimension through which their ideas needed to be transferred outside of academia as well, and really make an impact and do something with it. So the idea of thinking in action is an important component of it.
And in fact, one of the things that I'm reminded of, one of the things that John Akenfrey mentions when talking about the importance of Stuart Hall was how he was like a superstar and on TV in the 70s. And it was the first time you would see on TV, I don't know if you mentioned the black person who was not singing or crooning or something. And he actually says that you saw like an intellectual who, a black, and I don't know if he mentioned black, but who was not a black person, who was not dancing or singing or crooning or whatever, but
playing sport
or playing sport, but actually saying very clever things. And this for him in the 70s, of course, and this ties back to generational things, issues, was super impactful for Akenfrey. But I think trying to map the Sandra has been doing that with her projects on all things digital. But for me, it's difficult because we are living in the moment. It's difficult to, like Will's questions are very it's so difficult to answer how an intellectual could be, because of course Sandra mentioned we are done with figures but that is like Chomsky on these big figures, but and there's the need for different collectives as figures or figures as collectives, but it's.
And also in the feminist movement, there always still need of kind of role models, you know, in so many sectors where they are not present or visible or marginalized. You still do need some kind of role models, and we don't have Angela Davis for nothing, you know. And I think there are question of layering, but the star system is of course very much linked to the US academia, US world, and in Europe we operate more content-wise. Was discussing, I think, and then I close. In France, being an intellectual is part of everyone. Yeah, everyone is very much culturally invested and thinking, and in Italy, being an intellectual is more being in the movement, really on the street, you know, being a partisan, being a revolutionary is much more the third cinema style. So I think intellectual means many different things in different cultures and cannot be homogenized.
Well, I have to leave you all, but this is
yes, I think we're going to bring it to a close.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for offering
Thank
this
you so
wonderful
much.
audio. We didn't have time to
Thank you
discuss
for
it until now with Anna.
Well, it's always a good point to end. We can always do another one.
I'd
Thank
love to because I'm
you
very,
very much for
I'm very fascinated by the topic. I've been for years, so I'm happy that Anna
the
Yeah,
enjoyed it
I
too.
think it shows. Yeah, if we didn't have Yael here, we would still be peering over the photographs and talking. And yeah,
yeah. No,
thank
it's
you.
yeah. I'm sorry for doing that. It's a I was just conscious of people's time, but
Yeah.
we are open for another one. Absolutely.
Thank you very
so
much. I really enjoyed it.
Stimulate us too much.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the podium. Have a
Thank
lovely
you.
evening.
Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'll stop the
Bye-bye.
recording. I remember how to do it.